Howdy folks, and welcome back to World of Warships with Rear Admiral Jingles. I have absolutely no doubt that what I'm going to be talking about in today's video is going to upset quite a lot of people. Tough. I'm afraid you're just going to have to deal with it. I'm going to be talking about the Deadeye skill, and it's probably not going to be what you're expecting. I'm not going to be complaining that it's a broken and overpowered skill that promotes, incentivizes and rewards bad gameplay, even though it is a broken and overpowered skill that promotes, incentivizes and rewards bad gameplay. Instead, one of the points that I'm going to try to make here and try to prove, and this particular battle, courtesy of Master Chief here in the Soviet Tier 10 battleship the Slava, is a perfect example on many different levels of exactly the kind of things that I'm going to be talking about. But one of those points is that any actual effect that the Deadeye skill has on the way random battles in World of Warships play out is almost insignificant compared to the perception that people have of how the Deadeye skill affects the way battles play out. Now, for those of you who understand what the Deadeye skill is and how it works, I'm afraid you're just going to have to bear with me, because for the benefit of people who perhaps don't play World of Warships or haven't played World of Warships since the Commander skill rework, I'm going to have to explain what the Deadeye skill is, how it works, and what its effect is. So, Deadeye is a battleship-only skill that improves the dispersion or accuracy of your main battery guns, provided there are no visible enemy ships within your surface detection radius. Now, Master Chief Slava here, if you look at the dotted line surrounding his ship on the minimap, that's his surface detection radius, 13.2 kilometers. So, providing there are no visible enemy ships inside that dotted circle, his guns are 10% more accurate. Now, on a ship like the Slava, which is basically equipped with railguns anyway, it's not that big a buff. It's still a buff, but, well, the Slava doesn't tend to miss at things that it shoots at from long range anyway. But it is definitely a significant buff for a whole bunch of other battleships, for example British battleships that tend to have low surface detection ranges, and guns with respectable ranges, which is why we're suddenly seeing a whole bunch of Thunderers, in fact a whole bunch of battleships in general, dominating the matchmaking. This battle is no exception. Almost half of the ships in this battle are battleships, and that's not unusual. Equally not unusual is the fact that 40% of those battleships are Thunderers. Equally not unusual is the fact that all of those battleships, including Master Chief here in the Slava, although this has kind of always been what the Slava was good at anyway, are cruising around the back of the map, firing at everything at long range, taking advantage of that Deadeye skill, because why the hell wouldn't they? It makes their guns 10% more accurate. So that's what the Deadeye skill is, and that's the effect that it's having. There are more battleships than usual in the matchmaking queue. More of those battleships are ships like the Thunderer. There are fewer cruisers, and those cruisers that are around tend to fall into two categories: the type of cruiser that excels at long-range gunfights anyway, like the Petropavlovsk, Hindenburg and Zau that we can see in this battle, or the kind of cruisers that can survive because they have smoke screens to hide in, like the two Smolensks. The relative lack of cruisers and the plethora of battleships also means that it's party time for the destroyers, which is another reason why the battleships are not being incentivized to move forward, because torpedoes. Bearing all of this in mind, is it really any surprise, and can you really blame the battleship players for playing like this? Particularly since a Deadeye battleship skill build only costs you 10 points, and a tanking build is going to cost you a minimum of 14, and is less effective than it was prior to the Commander skill rework. So can you really blame the battleship players for playing as passively as they currently seem to be? Particularly since, well, just look at what happened to the Republic that tried to push up and support the Smolensk in Capture Point Alpha. First one dead. Should have stayed at the back with the rest of the battleships. Or should he? I'm going to argue yes, because the second he popped up as a target, there were 5 other battleships with 10% more accurate guns, all lighting him up at the same time. But is that really the fault of the Deadeye skill? Well, I'm going to say yes it is and no it isn't. I'm going to say no it isn't because any battleship that suddenly finds itself getting shot at by 5 other battleships and possibly also a couple of cruisers and destroyers is not going to last very long. I'm also going to state that it's impossible to say clearly one way or the other in this particular battle because we didn't actually see the circumstances of the Republic's death. We just know that he was the first one to die, and we saw where he was when it happened, over here. So we can see that he was well ahead of all of the other battleships at the time, but you can also see from his positioning that he was given broadside to at least 3 battleships on the enemy team. So was it the Deadeye skill that got him killed, or was it poor timing and positioning? Well, we didn't actually see it happening, so again, we can't categorically state for sure one way or the other, but under the circumstances, I'm inclined to go with poor timing and positioning. However, I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb here and say something that might not be popular, but I'm pretty sure is true. Because the actual facts surrounding the early demise of the Republic are almost completely irrelevant. The fact is, the Deadeye skill is what is going to be blamed for his early death. Because he didn't hang around at the back of the map, like the other battleships, enjoying the benefits of the Deadeye skill. He pushed forward, and he died, at the hands of all of the other battleships who were using the Deadeye skill. But hang on, Jingles, doesn't that prove that he did die as a result of the Deadeye skill? Well, yes he did, and no he didn't. I'm pretty sure he did die as a result of poor timing and positioning. But that doesn't actually matter, because all of the other battleships are where they are because of the Deadeye skill. Even if they're not where they are because of the Deadeye skill. I realise it sounds like I'm talking in circles, but what I'm actually trying to say here, how effective the Deadeye skill is or isn't is actually completely irrelevant. I suspect, if I'm being completely honest, that it's probably not quite as dangerously game-breaking as many people, myself included, have been complaining. I mean, battleships that surf the map border firing at everybody at the extreme limit of their range have always been mostly pretty ineffective. If they're now just 10% slightly less ineffective, it's really not going to change anything much. With the exception, of course, of ships like the Slava, that was specifically designed to play like this. The actual facts, the data, the numbers, in game mechanic terms of how much more or less effective battleships are as a result of taking the Deadeye skill and playing in this manner is almost completely irrelevant, and always has been. The facts of the matter have almost always been completely irrelevant, because what is important and what does change the way the game plays is the perception that people have of how something like the Deadeye skill influences gameplay. And if the perception is what everybody thinks is true, then by extension, it becomes true. Because everybody is now playing differently because of the way they perceive the facts to be, regardless of whether or not those facts are actually facts. In many ways, it's a bit like the stock market, because the stock market is all based on confidence and perception and has absolutely nothing to do with how well or badly a company is actually doing. It's all based on the perception of how well or badly a company is doing or is expected to do. For example, a couple of years ago, Blizzard Activision posted record profits, and their share prices fell, wiping hundreds of millions of dollars off the value of the company, right after they'd posted record profits. So, facts versus perception. The fact of the matter was that Blizzard Activision had been wildly more profitable than they had ever been in their history up until that point. But the perception was that they should have sold more, and so their share price fell. Makes no sense, but that's how the stock market works, at its most basic. In response to the falling share prices, Blizzard Activision sacked 800 employees. Now, I don't know how much the average Blizzard Activision employee is paid, but I suspect that even if you sack 800 of them, that's not going to make up the hundreds of millions of dollars that got wiped off the share prices. Maybe if they'd just sacked one, the guy in charge, it would have made up the hundreds of millions of dollars that had just been wiped off their share prices. In fact, it very definitely would have made up the hundreds of millions of dollars that had just been wiped off their share prices. But again, the fact of the matter is almost completely irrelevant, because the perception was that they were doing something to restructure the company, which restored confidence, and their share prices climbed again. The facts are irrelevant. It's the perception of the facts that influences how things work. And it's this perception of the Deadeye skill that battleships are vastly more effective when they surf around the map border, shooting at everybody at long range and enjoying that 10% better accuracy, is leading to battleships doing exactly that. And because battleships are doing exactly that, and there are so many more battleship players playing because they think it makes them more effective, we're seeing less cruisers playing. And the cruisers that are playing tend to either be cruisers that have smoke screens, like the Smolensk, or cruisers that tended to excel at long-range gunnery anyway, like the Hindenburg, like the Zao. And because there are less cruisers playing, because there are more battleships playing with Deadeye, we're seeing more destroyers, because there are also less radars around. And all of those destroyers have torpedoes, which is doing nothing to encourage the battleships to abandon the map border and get in close. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And it's all based on that one assumption, that the Deadeye skill makes battleships better if they stay at the back of the map and shoot at everybody at long range. It's like an inverted pyramid with the Deadeye skill at the bottom, and it only works as long as everybody believes that that's true. And that's always been the problem, because as long as people believe that something like this is true, it becomes true, regardless of whether or not it's based on fact or fiction. So we end up in the frankly hilarious situation where the game meta has changed. And it's changed as a result of the commander skill rework in general, which was probably to be expected. I mean, if you change the way a whole bunch of skills work, the game itself is probably also going to change. But the perception is that it's all because of the Deadeye skill. And because we think that's true, it's become true, with all of the knock-on effects that I've just detailed. Which is kind of amusing. The thing is, changing that perception is really, really hard, because that's just not how human minds work. We like to tell ourselves that we base our opinions on facts, but that's rarely actually the case. What tends to happen is that we have a gut feeling about how we think something works or how it should work, and then we look for facts to support our opinion. And the best example that I can think of to illustrate what I mean here would be politics. Now, I'm not going to go into specific details here because, well, you can imagine what the comment section would be like. However, let me just give you a broad example. Conservatives versus liberals. The Conservatives cannot possibly be wrong all the time. It's just statistically impossible. But you'll never find a liberal who'd be prepared to admit that the Conservatives could be right about anything. And it works the other way too. Liberals have a gut feeling on where they should stand on certain issues. Conservatives do too, and both sides pick and choose facts and arguments to support their positions. They're rarely objective about it. As in politics, so it is in life, and so it is here in World of Warships. And there's a perfect example of exactly that sort of thing, which has been going on in chat. I don't know if you've been following it. What it boils down to is that one of the Smolensks on the team managed to get himself killed quite early over in Capture Point Alpha. And he's been spending the entire game since then complaining in chat to anybody who'll listen that essentially because of this Deadeye skill, his battleships have all been useless, staying at the back of the map and not moving up to support him when he pushed into that cap circle. Now, objectively, he is technically correct, because that is more or less exactly what happened. He pushed up into the cap circle, he was mostly alone when he did so, and he died. But was it because the battleships were all staying at the back of the map? Or is there another explanation for why he died so early? Because that's another thing about human nature. Whenever something goes wrong, it's an extremely rare individual who first points the finger of blame at themselves, honestly and objectively assesses their own performance and contribution, and only then, once they've satisfied themselves that they really did the best they possibly could, do they start looking at external sources of blame. What tends to happen is the exact opposite. So let's just examine what happened to that Smolensk in more detail, and then you can make your own minds up, because there are two conflicting sets of facts here. And unusually, they are both facts, they're both true. On the one hand, you have the Smolensk saying that he pushed up into that cap circle, and with no support from his battleships, he died. And as far as I can tell, that is factually correct. He did push up into Cap Circle Alpha. He appears to have died there, and as best as I can tell, he didn't receive much or any support from the battleships on the team. Now that Smolensk is claiming that by extension, because of this Deadeye skill, all of the battleships were, at that point of the battle, being far too passive. None of that is really being disputed. However, there's an alternative perspective, and it's also entirely factual. And if you've been paying attention in chat, this perspective has been delivered at great detail and with extraordinary amounts of patience by the Shimakaze who sank him. Because it turns out that just I moved up into Cap Circle Alpha and got no support from my battleships and died isn't in fact telling the whole story. According to the Shimakaze who sank that Smolensk, what happened was he moved up into Cap Circle Alpha, admittedly without any support whatsoever from his battleships, and hold on to that thought, because we'll be coming back to it in a moment. Got spotted by a Shimakaze. The Shimakaze got spotted in return, so the Smolensk knew that he was there instead of shooting at the Shimakaze, presumably because he'd been spotted and was getting shot at by all of the battleships that knocked out the Republic just a couple of moments earlier. And instead, within 10 kilometers of the Shimakaze, slowed to a stop, popped his smoke screen, did not use his hydroacoustic search consumable, and died to torpedoes fired into the smoke screen by that Shimakaze. So what he's saying is technically true. He pushed into Cap Circle A, didn't get any support from the battleships, and died. But is that the battleship's fault? If you've been following the conversation in chat, he absolutely insists that it's the battleship's fault. And it's another perfect example of the sort of thing that I'm talking about. Despite masses of evidence to the contrary, people so very rarely, objectively and honestly, assess their own performance and look for fault there, when it's so much easier to point the finger elsewhere. And it's not only being dishonest to yourself, it's also completely ineffective. Because nobody is going to start playing the way you think they should just because you call them bad for doing it. Even if you're right, because it's far easier to point the finger of blame at someone else rather than honestly and objectively evaluate your own performance, which is the only thing you can actually change anyway. And if any further proof were needed that people can't even see the facts of the matter when they're right in front of their face, the Smolensk, again if you've been paying attention to chat, in attempting to advance his own argument, is actually making a fairly convincing case for the opposition, but he just can't see it. He's saying that once the BBs start pushing, things will change. And again, I can't actually argue with the factual content of the statement that he made. The BBs have started pushing, and things have changed. The team have gone from being 400 to 500 points behind, with none of the caps, to holding all 3 of the caps and just having the enemy carrier to finish off. The Smolensk is technically and factually correct. But if you can see that things don't start to change until the battleships start to push, why did you rush unsupported into Cap Circle A in the first place? Do you not see how you're proving your own counter-argument here? But of course he doesn't. He's incapable of seeing how his own argument is undermining his own argument. Because that would require admitting that he could and should have done better. And it's always easier to blame something else. It's like the player who sees his entire team lemming training down one flank, sees it happening, goes down the other flank, alone and unsupported, dies, and then blames that on the team. You can blame the team for lemming training down one side of the map, but your decision to go the other side unsupported when you could see it happening is nobody's fault but your own. The facts that there are more battleships playing since the commander skill rework and the introduction of the Deadeye skill, and that these battleships are hanging around at the back of the map more, and that because there are more battleships there are less cruisers and therefore more destroyers, and therefore more torpedoes, which is not incentivising the battleships to move up. None of these facts are in dispute. Whether or not it's all the fault of the Deadeye skill, however, is a matter of perception. I'm not convinced that the Deadeye skill is actually making battleships more effective by staying at the back of the map than they were prior to the rework. But whether that's a fact or not is completely irrelevant because everybody is behaving as if it is a fact. There are more battleships playing. They are staying further back than they used to, which means there are now less cruisers playing, which means there are more destroyers playing, which means there are more torpedoes around, which means the battleships are even less anxious to move forward than they were originally. You can trace all of this back to the Deadeye skill. But that doesn't mean the Deadeye skill is responsible for it. It means that people believe the Deadeye skill is responsible for it. And because people believe that, it becomes true. And then the problem's compounded by the sheer unwillingness of people to adapt to the way the game is now being played. Instead, insisting that everyone else is doing it wrong, and everything that happens is everybody else's fault, instead of taking a long critical look at the way they play, and changing the way they play to accommodate the way the game is actually played, instead of the way they want the game to be played. If you don't like it, you do always have the option of just not playing. But simply complaining that things aren't being played the way you think they should is not going to get you anywhere fast. Equally, trying to point out that something as relatively inconsequential as a single 4-point battleship captain skill shouldn't have changed the game meta to this kind of degree is equally pointless, because everybody believes that it has, and so it actually has. You'd be far better advised to spend your precious time and effort figuring out a way to adapt and deal with the situation as it is, rather than the situation as you think and wish it should be. And that, by the way, is a lesson that you can apply to life in general with much better personal results for you than you'll ever experience here in World of Warships. I guess all that remains is to take a final look at the scoreboard here and note with some, I don't know if irony is the right word, that the surviving members of the team, and all the members of the team who hung around at the back of the map for the first half of the battle, are the ones who scored more than 2,000 base experience. Shouldn't be true, but it is. And the sooner we all adapt our ways and learn to accommodate it, the sooner we'll all be happier when playing World of Warships. Congratulations on the result, Master Chief. Between you, definitely turned that battle around. Everyone else, I hope you've enjoyed today's video. I hope it's given you something to think about. I know it's given you something to talk about. And as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.